Welcome everyone to another First Sunday Fun Day session with HGP, the Humanists of Greater Portland. My name is Anand Atre, and it is my privilege to be your MC for today's event, which is being recorded. HGP believes strongly in freedom of speech, but the views expressed by myself, our musicians, today's speaker, HGP members, and our guests at today's meeting are not the official views of the Humanists of Greater Portland. For those who are new to humanism or HGP, humanism represents a progressive way of thinking that is informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. A humanistic approach to life is grounded in reason and our shared humanity, making a humanistic lifestyle one that aligns with social and planetary responsibility. Humanistic values are not based on appeals to external deities. Instead, they are formed when humans use reason and reflect with empathy on our experiences, collective needs, and capacity for flourishing. Paramount among these values is the commitment to uphold the dignity of all human beings. Before we hear from this week's speaker, we're going to have one more sing-song. So Pete, Paul, and Mike, hit us with another one.
Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Ooh. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for. And no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You might say that I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger. A brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You might say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one.
What a fantastic way to actually get our session started today. Thank you so much, Pete, Paul, and Mike. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, who is joining us over Zoom. He is the Jane Bishop Associate Professor of Political Science at Wellesley College. He is also a visiting fellow in the Reimagining Democracy program at the Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. He received his PhD in political science from UC Irvine in 2019. His presentation today is based on his 2025 book, Parties and Prejudice: The Normalization of Anti-Minority Rhetoric in US Politics. It will provide us with vital insights into how what was once considered extreme rhetoric on supremacist forums is now routinely used as standard campaign messaging by numerous mainstream politicians. It promises to be an informative and timely presentation. So please join me in giving a big HGP welcome to Manish Arora.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Anand, for that great introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Wonderful. So I'm especially honored to be here. My parents have been members for a long time, so I'm really happy to be able to do this presentation. So just a couple of things. I live in the Boston area, and as it has every few days, we're getting hit with a lot of snow right now again. And so it might affect my Wi-Fi a little bit, so I apologize if that's the case. And then I also want to say my 1.5-year-old is running around, so if you hear him yelling or if he runs into the room, I apologize for any interruptions. But otherwise, I will get started. I have some slides prepared. Let's see. Can you give me a little thumbs up if you can see my screen? Awesome, thank you. So as Anand said, this presentation is based on my book that was published by University of Chicago Press last year called Parties and Prejudice: The Normalization of Anti-Minority Rhetoric in US Politics. Like a lot of other political science these days, it was inspired in no small part by Donald Trump, or he who must not be named. He was running for president the first time in 2015 when I was in graduate school. And, I was reading a lot of political science work that was saying, if political elites kind of say the quiet parts out loud, if they're explicitly racist, that should harm their political campaigns, because we have this norm against using that kind of language, being explicitly racist, right? And so I'm reading this and I'm watching Trump, and something doesn't fit here, right? And so I really wanted to understand, how can we explain Trump's rise to political power, and what effect did his rhetoric, particularly his rhetoric targeting minority groups, what effect did that actually play in turnout and in the election results, right? But as I dug deeper into this, I saw that there was this other puzzle here, and I want to start with that puzzle, and then I'll kind of get through the rest of, kind of giving an overview of the book. And this puzzle was, if we think about somebody like Steve King is a former representative from Iowa, right? He said this quote. He said, "Here's a thought that occurred to me. I didn't look at the population of Germany at the beginning of the Third Reich, but it's probably in the area of 70 to 80 million is my guess. And out of that, Hitler in a few years built something that cost the lives of roughly 60 million people. The radical Islamists have 1.3 or more billion Muslims to work with. Now, they aren't all supporters. Daniel says 10 to 15% of them, but that is a huge population to draw from." Now, this was pretty par for the course for a lot of Steve King's very overtly Islamophobic rhetoric. He had been saying things like this for a long time. He continued to say things after that. This was in 2014, so he was reelected that year. He was then reelected in 2016 and in 2018, right? So he got reelected several times. After this, whether in spite of this or because of this, unclear, right? But certainly this kind of language did not hurt Steve King's re-election chances. But then he said this quote in 2019, "White nationalist, white supremacist, Western civilization, how did that language become offensive? Why did I sit in classes teaching about the merits of our history and our civilization?" This quote was deemed by many to be racist, right? He was called out by certainly members of the Democratic Party, but even some members of the Republican Party. He was criticized in the media. His donors started leaving him. and he ended up getting primaried, and he lost his seat in the House of Representatives the following election, right? So the question then to me is, why is it socially acceptable to openly discriminate against some groups and not others? How do we actually explain this? Because if we look back at Trump, especially in the first term, much of his anti-minority rhetoric was targeting Muslims, immigrants, but there were some groups conspicuously left out of his at least overt negative attention. And I think that this can help explain a lot of our current politics, right? So that's kind of the puzzle that I started with here. And so my central argument then was that there's some interaction happening between party politics and social norms that's key to understanding how prejudice works in the political sphere, right? So, part of this is that politicians and especially certain political parties have incentives to mobilize people based on their anti-minority views, right? I think this is very clear and has always been very clear in American politics. But that we have to have the other piece of this of understanding the social norms at play to actually understand what that prejudice is going to look like, right? And so basically, I'm saying that norms guiding political messaging vary based on a couple of things. One is the subject group of the message, right? So in that Steve King example, I would say that explicitly Islamophobic rhetoric pretty accepted in mainstream society in America. Explicit anti-Black racism, less so, right? And so I think that norm varies based on the subject group. I also think it matters who the audience is, right? I think it's not a surprise that Steve King is a Republican, that Donald Trump is a Republican, and that most of the people who we see being overtly anti-minority tend to be Republicans, right? There's other characteristics certainly that tie these people together, but that's part of how the audience matters, right? And so basically, I think that it looks something like this, right? For some groups, there's some form of norm of equality that's been established. If that's the case, then I think messaging that's targeting that group is probably going to be rejected. And that'll lead to some political cost to the messenger, right? We saw this for a long time. The kind of conventional wisdom is that after the civil rights movement, it's not that anti-Black racism went away, but it became coded, right? You had to use code words, dog whistles, if you've heard that term, to activate the kind of anti-Black attitudes among the public, right? But for other groups, no norm of equality has been established, and there might even be inegalitarian norms that are guiding rhetoric towards that group. If that's the case, then I think that messaging is more likely to be accepted, and that could lead to some political benefit to the person who's using that language. And that's where I think we see this variation and which groups are getting the brunt of the negative political attention in current politics. And so part of this, we got to understand then, how do norms develop, right? If we think that they matter a lot in explaining something about contemporary politics, it's helpful to have some understanding of where they came from. And so I think that there's several things, but basically they develop through some consistent set of signals of commitment to a norm from influential actors who interact with mass attitudes in a kind of mutually reinforcing way. Right. And so, these influential leaders can be political leaders, politicians, leaders of political parties. They can be political institutions, right? The Supreme Court, Congress passing bills, etc. The media plays a big role. And then mass movements, social movements, right? They, I think, impact norms as well. And then there's this other piece of exogenous shock. So think about 9/11, right? 9/11 happens, and I think that really changed the norm of what was acceptable to say and not say, right? The economic recession in 2007, 2008, right? I think that was an exogenous shock that also probably changed norms, what's okay, what's not okay. So we have this set of factors, and that helps precipitate some set of norms, whether egalitarian or inegalitarian. So that's one piece of the puzzle, and I'm happy to come back to this in the Q&A. But what I really want to get to is the crux of the argument, why the subject group matters and why the audience matters. And I think that the subject group matters because first, those factors that contribute to a development of a norm are just not equally present for all minority groups, right? So if we're sticking with that example of some norm of racial equality being developed, right? Think about all of the things that happened to bring that about, right? There was a massive social movement, the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement. There were the most prominent politicians in the land, you know, JFK, LBJ kind of figures who were showing some commitment to that norm. The media got behind it. Political institutions, right? We had the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. All of these factors together created this norm of racial equality. Now, again, I want to caution, I'm not saying that racism went away, it just became coded, right? But it became unacceptable to be overtly racist, right? And it was because of those sets of factors. But think about all of the other minority groups in the country that haven't had those set of factors, right? Muslim Americans, the LGBT community, there's all these groups, immigrants, so many groups that haven't had this set of factors that would lead to a similar norm of equality, right? So that's one piece of this. And then second, in various time periods, due to social and political phenomena, some groups are just more likely than others to be cast as urgent threats in the public imagination, right? You know, the case study I'm going to highlight in this talk is the current kind of anti-transgender language being used. And I think for a set of factors, the transgender community has become the kind of current boogeyman in the public imagination, right? And so this is the second part of this, that at different time periods, and we can see it throughout history, right? Whether it's Black Americans, Japanese Americans during World War II, Muslim Americans after 9/11, transgender Americans now, we see this change over time, which groups are kind of cast as urgent threats, right? Which move people towards fear, anger, hatred, right? So that's the second part of why I think the subject group matters and would influence the expression of prejudice. The second part is that the audience matters. And I think there's several parts of this. How does an audience become a group? How do norms manifest in different ways among, let's say, the example I use in my book, Republicans versus Democrats? I think it's based on three things. So one is whether or not there are opportunities for communication within groups. Two, whether or not there's group cohesion. And three, whether or not the particular norm matters to the group. And I think we see this very clearly with partisan groups in America, right? There's a lot of opportunities for communication just within the Republican Party, just within the Democratic Party, right? We have a highly polarized media environment. We have a highly polarized social media environment. And we live in pretty segregated communities, right? Based on many things, but also based on partisanship, right? There's growing evidence that we are friends with people of our own party. We talk to people of our own party and tend to not cross party, right? And so all of that leads to there being pretty clear communication lines within partisan groups. The second part is that there's group cohesion. And there's a lot of political science research demonstrating that not only have we become spatially segregated based on our partisan groups, but it's become a big part of our personal identities, right? We increasingly identify as Democrats or Republicans, and that identity matters to us, right? So, you know, one of the interesting statistics here is for a long time, you know, if you ask white Americans, are you okay with your child marrying someone of the opposite race? People said, absolutely not, right? And then that started to go away in the 70s, 80s, 90s, right? Now, if you ask people, are you okay with your child marrying someone of the opposite party? People say, no, I'm not okay with that, right? That's how much partisan identity has become such a big part of our personal identities, right? We're unwilling often to be friends with people of the other party, and we certainly don't want our children marrying people of the other party, right? And then the third is, and this was a big part of the argument, that these norms matter, especially for the Republican Party, right? Think about how Trump reformed the Republican Party and built his base. It was largely based on signaling his very strong anti-immigrant, Islamophobic, in general anti-minority chops, right? And so it matters then for elections and it matters for building a base, right? In the 2024 election, the lasting political ad was an anti-transgender ad, right? That is where the Republican Party and Donald Trump decided this is where we need to put our money, right? Is in advertisements that are explicitly attacking transgender Americans, right? So this norm matters for these parties and is helpful, especially for the Republican Party, to build a base of supporters, right? So again, happy to come back to this, but this is my argument for why I think the audience matters and why anti-minority messaging is going to land differently for Republicans and for Democrats. So in the book, I present 3 case studies, right? So chapters 4, 5, and 6 of my book are these different case studies. And just to show you a quick summary, chapter 4, I looked at anti-Black messaging. And what I tend to find was in line with my empirical expectations that overt anti-Blackness was generally rejected by both Democrats and Republicans. Now, I'll get to this at the end of, is this still true, right? Most of this data was from between 2018 and 2022. Things have changed a little bit since then, but that was generally what I found, right? Chapter 5, I looked at anti-Muslim or Islamophobic messaging, and I generally found that it was more or less accepted by the public and much more so than anti-Black racism, right? Almost the exact same messaging, just switching out Black for Muslim led to much greater support for political candidates, policies, the messages themselves, right? So I ran a bunch of different experiments and looked at a bunch of different survey data to basically demonstrate that, you know, anti-Black racism, when it's overt, tends to be rejected. Overt Islamophobia, generally accepted. Now, where things got a lot more complicated was in chapter 6. I was looking at mostly anti-gay and anti-transgender messaging. And what I started to see was that there's a lot of reasons to believe that these norms are in flux, right? There's a long time of developing norms of, you know, gay rights, but that started to destabilize. And some segments of the community, notably transgender Americans, are facing a lot of negative political attention, right? So I'm going to get into what I found in that chapter. So, you know, what I started with was that some tenuous egalitarian norms for gay and lesbian people tended to exist, right? While those norms were basically non-existent for the transgender community. So that's the norms piece of this. And remember, going back to my central argument, there's an interaction between norms and party politics. So the party politics part was that after the marriage equality Supreme Court decision, social conservatives needed to find a new issue to mobilize around, right? They had spent decades mobilizing their base to prevent marriage equality, right? That had been a major part of their fundraising efforts, a major part of their mobilization efforts to get people out to vote, to get people to support or oppose policies. It was a huge part of how they kept their base together. And then marriage equality happens and the norm shifts, and now they need something new, right? And so I think this was a very intentional, targeted thing where they found that new issue in opposition to transgender rights, right? And I think they could see that, listen, even if there's some norm that's being created to protect gay and lesbian people and gay and lesbian rights, not really there for the transgender community, and we're going to take advantage of that, right? So just getting into this a little bit, just quick bit of history, right? Now, there's not a lot of survey data on this, but I found one in 1984 where 94% of the more than 2,000 gay and lesbian respondents said they experienced physical and verbal abuse, right? Think about that statistic. 94% said that, and I think that we're asking within the last year, have you experienced physical or verbal abuse? I mean, that's just like an astounding number to consider, right? And that was the conditions 40 years ago, right? And I think this quote helped kind of sum that up. So I'm not going to get deeper into this, but I want to read this quote, right? So this is a gay rights activist said, it is apparent that condemnation of homosexuality is today almost universal. Occasionally one encounters an attitude not so much of tolerance, but of actual acceptance, but this is rare. The basic problem is the hostile spirit pervading even the more permissive of modern people. So I want to show this as a way of helping us understand how these norms changed from the mid 80s to the 2010s, right? So, you know, there was a lot of increased activism after Stonewall, and then in the 80s in response to the AIDS crisis. And these communities strategically targeted key political and media elites to gain institutional support for gay rights and really to normalize media coverage of the community. Do people remember the shows like Will and Grace and Queer Eye for the Straight Guy? You know, I know these are TV shows, but I think that they had a big impact on normalizing homosexuality to a broader populace, right? And these were very intentional acts by activists and supporters of gay rights, right? And what this did was it helped demonstrate a groundswell of public support for gay rights. And what I think was really interesting, and some great scholars have written about this, all of that activism really encouraged gay and lesbian people to come out kind of en masse, which increased interpersonal exposure to members of the community, right? So there was this real groundswell of, you know, this social movement that's really strategically targeting political and media elites, trying to build institutional support. They're trying to change media coverage, and that is helping get gay and lesbian people to become more open, and that's changing things among the masses, right? And this all helped kind of create or mainstream support for gay rights, right? And so just to show this in one way, so this is an overtime Gallup poll that looks at the question of, do you think marriages between same-sex couples should or should not be recognized by the law as valid with the same rights as traditional marriages, right? So I don't know how well you can see the shading of the lines, but this blue line is the percent saying should not be valid. And then there's a green line showing that it should be valid, right? So, you know, in the 90s, almost 70% of people saying no, should not be valid, right? We're basically the exact opposite place now, right? Where 69% of Americans say yes. You know, marriages between same-sex couples should be recognized and have the same rights as traditional marriages, right? And I think that's a very clear sign of the success of the gay rights movement, right? And in changing the norms around gay rights, right? So that's just like a quick bit of history. Hopefully that kind of helps us understand some of the earlier slides of how norms develop, but it leads us to the last decade, really, where we see this really intense, hostile, modern anti-transgender campaign, right? So, David Tracy of the Human Rights Campaign says that anti-LGBT messaging is just on another level from recent years. And I think you are all, I think, people who are very closely following the news, thinking about politics. I don't think I have to sell you on this, that political leaders are much more hostile, very openly hostile to the transgender community in recent years, right? Think about the political institutions, right? So, Trump has been in office the second time for just over a year, and his executive actions have restricted access to gender affirming care, banned transgender girls from youth sports, and in many cases eliminated federal funding for schools that quote unquote indoctrinate children based on quote unquote gender ideology, right? And we have had, and this is a figure, I keep updating these slides because this number just keeps going. We've had 800 plus bills introduced in 35 states over the last 4 years that are explicitly restricting LGBTQ plus rights, right? So, we're seeing this from political leaders, we're seeing this from political institutions. There's also a mass movement, right? So, I'm always looking for kind of new reports here. They're a little bit slow to come out sometimes, but even just thinking about 2021 to 2022, tracking anti-minority demonstrations or protest demonstrations, saw that anti-LGBT demonstrations doubled from 2021 to 2022, and violent acts tripled from 21 to 22, right? And this is a trend that continues to grow. And I'll show you a little bit of data on this in a second, but we're seeing a ton of increased negative attention from the media, right? And so, in a second, I'll get to why all this matters. But, we have this recent history of creating a tenuous norm of equality for the gay community. And now it's kind of clashing with really pervasive anti-transgender messaging that I think is creating a very pervasive norm of inequality or inegalitarian norms for the transgender community. So my expectations kind of going into this chapter were basically that we would find pretty identifiable variation in support for anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric. So not a clear story like in chapter 4 where, hey, people tend to reject explicitly racist messaging. Chapter 5, people tend to accept Islamophobic messaging, right? But I think we're going to find pretty major partisan and religious variation. Thinking about the groups that are pushing a lot of this, social conservatives tends to be Republicans and members of the evangelical community. I also think there's an age variation. So I'll show some data on this, but there's always been a trend that young people adapt to a new norm faster than older people. Though I will show you that I don't actually find support for this. And then also stratified norms in the sense of my expectation was that anti-gay messaging would be rejected more so than anti-transgender messaging. So let's just get into some of the data, right? So I first wanted to show some media trends because I thought this was really interesting, right? So this is just looking at the number of transgender mentions on CNN, Fox, and MSNBC. So let's take a look at this. This dashed line is Fox. This dash line is total networks. The black line is Fox. So what we see is, from 2014 to 2017, pretty steep rise, drops again. Then in 2020, huge rise, right? We're seeing a ton of mentions every year about the transgender community, right? Now let's compare this to the words lesbian, gay, bisexual, homosexual, and queer, and some of the similar words, right? And we just see the exact opposite, right? Hits its peak in 2013, drops in a major way from there. So there's been this replacement effect, right? Marriage equality happens, and all of a sudden, the media stops talking about this community. and instead focuses attention on the transgender community, right? So I just want to show that real quick as a backdrop. So what I then did was to try to test some of my expectations, and this is kind of what I did throughout the book, was I ran some experiments. So this particular experiment is from a June 2023 survey of a little over 4,000 respondents, nationally representative, right? So in the control group, I showed people this language that said, Representative Peter Miller, fake name, has proposed the Protect Parental Rights in Education Act. Also, fake bill, but based off a real bill. The bill would require school districts to notify parents of all reading material used in classroom instruction and allow parents to opt their child out of any reading material that the parent believes is quote unquote age inappropriate for their child. In support of his bill, Miller said, we will stand up for the rights of parents and the fundamental role they play in the education of their children. Now, this is very similar to a lot of bills that have been passed in many states. It was modeled after a bill in Florida and I think North Carolina, and has spread throughout the country, right? Doesn't say transgender, doesn't say anything like that explicitly. Though that is kind of what they're getting at, right? So then in treatment 1 and treatment 2, right? So these are 3 different sets of respondents. The control group saw just the wording under the control group. Treatment 1, just looking at that last sentence, saw, we will stand up for the rights of parents and the fundamental role they play in the education of their children by helping them protect their children from the immorality of transgenderism. And then treatment 2 replaced transgenderism with homosexuality, right? So the idea is that the control group is seeing a bill that was dressed up as, hey, we're just trying to protect parents' rights, right? Treatment 1, we're seeing that same thing, but hey, let's make this explicit, right? We're talking about the immorality of transgenderism. That's what we're protecting children from. And then that third one is, let's see, does it matter if we change it out for homosexuality? So real quick, looking at partisan support. So this is percent support on the y-axis for the policy. These dark bars are Republicans. The lighter gray is independents. And the lightest gray is Democrats, right? I apologize if this doesn't show up very well. I'm happy to send the slides if anyone wants to look at them. And we see some pretty major variation, right? So basically between 70 and about 77% of Republicans support this policy in the 3 treatment conditions. Democrats are closer to about 40 to 45%. Independents are about 40 to 50%, right? So pretty big partisan variation. We see this also if we look at support for the candidate, Peter Miller, right? Would you vote for this guy? Does he represent your interests? Again, we see Republicans much more supportive. The top bar is would you vote for him? The bottom graph is, does he represent your interests? And again, we see some pretty major partisan differences, okay? So, we find support for this. This is the last way I'll show it, is just asking a bunch of different ways that we see a lot of these bills restricting LGBT rights. Would you support banning classroom instruction that talks about transgenderism? Would you allow parents to sue the school district? All these different things. The diamonds are Republicans, much more supportive than Democrats, right? So in a bunch of different ways, we see that, yes, there's partisan variation. Republicans tend to be much more supportive of anti-transgender ideas and anti-gay ideas in any way that we talk about them, right? So, okay, support for that first hypothesis. Religious variation. So the same experiment, do we see differences across religious groups in how much people say they support the policy or the candidate? So here again, and I apologize for all these graphs. Again, happy to go through this more in Q&A. So in treatment 1 and treatment 2, what is the support for the policy and the candidate? The bars on the left are evangelicals, who tend to be the most supportive. And then in the middle, we see Catholics as the second most supportive. Those who say they have no religion, on average, tend to be least supportive of this policy and these candidates, whether you're talking about explicitly targeting transgender community or the gay community. Okay, so great. We find some support for this expectation around religious variation. Now let's get into age. I felt so confident about this, right? We saw this during the civil rights and Black Power movements, that young people took to the norm much faster than older people. We saw this during marriage equality. Young people became supportive of marriage equality much faster than older people. There's a lot of sociology literature to tell us that this should happen. I didn't find much evidence for this. I found that there's some small evidence that 18 to 29-year-olds are less supportive of anti-gay and anti-transgender messaging, but it was quite small. And after that, most of the other age groups look pretty similar. So, regardless of where we're at, it doesn't seem like age has just a ton of effect. Young people are maybe marginally less likely to be buying into the anti-transgender movement, but only slightly less so, right? So not a ton of support for that one. So let's get into the stratification. And this is where I think it gets really interesting. So this is, again, going back to that same experiment. Do we see among, all respondents, do we see differences in support for the candidate? Do we think that there's differences in interest representation and policy support in the control group? Treatment 1, which was anti-transgender, or treatment 2, which was anti-homosexual? We don't, right? All these bars look very similar. Whether the candidate is saying, protecting from the immorality of transgenderism or homosexuality, very similar support. The policy, same way, right? This was very surprising to me. So I really wanted to think through why am I finding this, right? I looked at all of this stuff showing that people were pretty supportive of gay rights, and there's a lot of evidence that they wouldn't be very supportive of transgender rights, right? So why do I get this result? So what I thought about was this idea of a spillover hypothesis, which is what I'm kind of referring to it as. And basically what this spillover is showing, or what my expectation is that opposition to transgender rights has spilled over into opposition to gay rights, right? And I think this can be explained in a couple different ways. One is that I think it's difficult for a lot of people to disassociate whatever threat they feel from the transgender community from the rest of the LGBTQ plus community, right? So if you're getting very consistent messages from political elites, political institutions, the media, that, hey, transgenderism is threatening to society, to the cultural mores of society, to children, all of this, I do think it's difficult for people to disentangle that from the rest of the LGBT community, right? This group has been lumped together for so long, right? And then the second part is, I just think that support for gay rights was maybe really tenuous to begin with. It might not have been very real. It might just have been that people understood the norm was to say that they supported gay rights. It's possible those people didn't actually support gay rights. And this is now cover to go back to, I never supported this in the first place, right? And so I think that can help us understand why we're not seeing really any differences in how people are responding to anti-gay or anti-homosexual rhetoric and anti-transgender rhetoric, okay? So I tested this using what's called a priming experiment centered on the 2023 boycott of Bud Light. Do people remember this? The Bud Light boycott? Yeah. See a lot of nodding heads. This happened when the company partnered with Dylan Mulvaney, a transgender spokesperson, right? So what I did was, in this same June 2023 survey, I asked half of the respondents, so a little over 2,000 respondents, how much have you heard or read about boycotts of Bud Light over a transgendered spokesperson? That's the only stimulus I gave them, right? The idea here is in a priming experiment is that if you subtly prime people, you subtly remind people of this thing that happened, and then you might be able to see some downstream changes in their attitudes, right? So a little over 2,000 respondents were asked, how much have you heard or read about this? The other 2,000 were not asked this question. That's the only difference in this experiment, right? And what I found was that primed respondents, those who read that sentence, were a little bit more likely to believe that gay and lesbian relations are morally wrong, a little bit less likely to believe that same-sex marriages should be recognized as legally valid, and a little less supportive of anti-discriminatory laws by about 2 percentage points. Not very large, right? But I think that's saying a lot, right? Simply asking people in a survey, have you heard about this thing that happened a few months ago? Led 2 percentage points decrease in believing that gay and lesbian relations are morally wrong, right? It shouldn't be that easy to change those attitudes if those attitudes were deeply held, right? That's kind of the finding here, right? Is if I gave a stronger experiment, I think those views would drop even more, right? And so I think that gets at this point that the support for gay rights was just so tenuously held in the first place. And that's kind of how I'm explaining this non-result that I'm finding, right? And I think this fits with real world examples, right? We're seeing political elites more overtly attack gay and lesbian people. We're seeing state legislatures targeting gay rights, right? They're going after marriage equality already, right? It's been less than 15 years since we had the Supreme Court case, and it's already happening, right? And it's not going to stop, right? And so, I think this kind of fits with what we're seeing in the real world. So, some implications of this, right? So one is, I think this helps clarify the relationship between social norms and political messaging. This is something people have been thinking about, writing about for a long time in my field. And, we just didn't quite know where do norms play a role in helping us understand what prejudice looks like in politics. And I think hopefully this book and the data and theory I've shown you today helps clarify that. It also sheds light on party politics, right? So, if we think about Trump version 2 versus Trump version 1, much more explicitly anti-minority now, right? And I think there's a lot of incentives for why that is, and it's clearly been kind of working for him, right? And it's helped him build a very loyal base. And so I think this sheds light on this book, hopefully sheds light on how he was able to build his power. And I think just as importantly, how he was able to maintain his power, right? And then the last thing I'm going to show you, and then I promise I'll get to Q&A, is chapter 7 in my book was looking at how do we develop strategies to combat political prejudice. I strongly believe if we're going to talk about all this academic stuff, if we're going to diagnose the problem, we should also try to find some solutions, right? And so one thing I want to show you, going back to another survey that I ran in 2023 on a sample of almost 3,000 people, I had just a one experiment, and I'll go through this super fast. In treatment 1, people were shown that there's this bill, and this Senator Kyle Anderson is referring to transgenderism, and I apologize for the language I'm going to use here, as a quote unquote abnormal lifestyle choice, and has promised to do everything he can to quote unquote eradicate transgenderism, right? And then in treatment two, I took a quote and some stats that came straight from an email I got from the Human Rights Campaign, where he's criticized by the CEO of the Human Rights Campaign for his comments about transgender people. The CEO discussed real-world consequences of Anderson's comments, citing a recent report that showed that 1 in 5 of any type of hate crime is now motivated by anti-transgender bias, and that more than 60% of transgender youth and their mental health has deteriorated as a result of recent efforts to restrict their rights. Sadly, all true statistics from a few years ago, right? So I wanted to see, hey, if we tell people that, this isn't just politics, this has real world effects on real people, does that change anything, right? And again, I'm going to show you some data. I promise I'll break this down more if you want in Q&A. In the treatment two, in the condemnation, if you just look at the lightest bar, which is full sample, the bar on the left, you see that it does decrease in treatment two, right? So control and treatment one, very similar support, right? For this candidate, fits with what I was showing in other parts of this book. But in treatment two, it does decrease. So hopefully ending on maybe a little bit of a hopeful note, there are things we can do about this, right? It is not a hopeless case or a lost cause, right? There are ways to combat prejudice in politics. And then, just real quick on future work, I'm working on a report right now to dig more into the spillover effect, thinking about kind of contemporary anti-transgender campaigns and its impact on the broader community. And then I think I've kind of used up all my time, so I'm just going to go to Q&A. I just have a couple of things on where things are in 2026 versus when I finish this book, but I think we'll probably get at that in the Q&A. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and I would love to hear what questions they are from the audience.
Thank you very much, Manish. It was fascinating how you elaborated on the puzzle that you started with on the double standards vis-a-vis discrimination of certain groups, and then presenting us a fascinating argument that unpacks the relationship between social norms and political messaging, and of course, the insight into party politics. Okay, so let's go to question number 1 at Friendly House. Please go ahead. Question 1 at Friendly House.
Don't you think that the only single item that separates LGBT plus from transgender is sports?
That's one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think sports is in a lot of ways where this started, right? It was sports and bathrooms, actually. That's where these anti-transgender bills started. But I think what is really notable here is it has morphed from that to real dehumanization, right? And so, I mean, I think what you're getting at is a political strategy where the people who decided, hey, the idea is now let's go after transgender rights. There's no norm of equality that exists there. The best way in are through things like bathrooms and sports. They're a little bit harder for people to combat. But it really has morphed to real erasure of the community, right? Removing gender affirming care for people, even though there are so many academic studies that show that gender affirming care is life-saving to a lot of people, right? So it's more from this place of, yes, I do tend to agree of sports and bathrooms and things that we may not think of as as kind of dehumanizing, but it's gotten to this place. And I do think it's spilling over to the rest of the community, even though sports and bathrooms isn't as much where you're seeing the kind of opposition to gay rights.
Okay, we'll take a question on Zoom. The name wasn't typed in, so that's, knocked off points for the prize. But Manish can read it, so I'm going to read it out for the audience at Friendly House so they can see what it is. It seems like Trump's anti-immigrant, anti-trans rhetoric is a mutation of Nixon's Southern strategy to divide sentiment among voters using race. If so, is race starting to fail as a Republican campaign tactic? It's from Kurt Mackey.
Oh, interesting. So, I'd be kind of curious as to why you think it's failing. I understand that sentiment has moved against Trump's immigration policy, but I think that's because of how shock and awe this policy has been. I mean, it just so clearly dehumanizing to extent that, yes, I do think has crossed lines, right? But I don't think the rhetoric has. I actually think, if you just kind of look at ICE political ads from the White House, I don't know if you saw, there was a confirmation hearing recently about somebody who's endorsed neo-Nazi ideas and has referred to themselves as a white supremacist. Like, I think it's moving in the other direction of, there any kind of norm of racial equality that did exist, I do think is eroding very quickly under the kind of Trump administration. So I think the rhetoric continues to be effective. I do think we've found maybe a line where the public is unwilling to go past when it comes to some of the ways that anti-immigrant agenda has been executed.
Well, yeah, and I just was wondering why they shifted to these other areas like anti-trans and anti-immigrant. That's kind of why I'm sure racism is still very strong in this country, but as a campaign tactic, why the shift?
Oh, I see. I understand your question now. Yeah, so that, yes, I think that the post civil rights, Black Power movement, this norm of equality started to take hold where it was just not acceptable as much to be openly racist.
Mhm.
And then the other part of that, getting back to something I mentioned way early on in the talk about how in different periods you see certain groups cast as the kind of urgent threat, right? And I think right now that has been, if we go back the last 25 years, that's been Muslims, that's been immigrants, that's been transgender Americans / maybe the rest of the LGBT community. And so I think that's why you see the strategy shift, because that's where people are viewing kind of cultural threat to the morals of the country, things like that, or violent threat, right? After 9/11, you just ask people how much they're worried about Islamic terrorism and things like that, and it was pretty high percentages, right? And so that's why I think you see a lot of that shifts in which groups are facing that anti-minority rhetoric.
Let's go to question number 2 at the Friendly House.
Yes. Why do so many, including political scientists, keep referring to radical reactionary actions such as the reversing of sections of the Voting Rights Act or reducing access to birth control as being taken by people described as conservatives rather than described as radical reactionaries?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, I guess what you're getting at is that's not really conservatism, right? And totally agree. And, I think that there's probably a lot of reasons for this, whether it's the media or academics. I think in general, probably slow to let go of the kind of normal language that's been used, right? So if people in that part of the political spectrum have been referred to as conservatives for so long, it's a little bit harder to maybe make that shift. I see this in my field all the time of not being able to call things racism, right? And using the term racial conservatism, right? Well, most of the time that's just racism, right? And so I mean to get I think to the crux of your question, I agree when something is racism, when something is radical or extremist, we should just refer to it as such. I think there's probably a lot of we are slow to adapt, but I agree that we should probably be faster to adapt to, yes, that is radical, reactionary, and it should probably just be called that.
Okay, we're going to take two on Zoom. It's one that's typed out. Manish can read it, so I'm going to read it out to you. Really making the MC sing for a supper here. Do you think your data would be different if you framed your question without using the word morality? Some people are opposed to transgender rights for reasons other than morality.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I have conducted a couple more experiments to look at, this is the thing with running experiments is that every word choice can matter, right? And so, yes, I agree. There's a lot of reasons that people give for opposing transgender rights. Some of it is about morality, some of it isn't. I used morality because that's in past experiments is often kind of the word choice that's been used. And in the way that scholars have talked about opposition to gay rights is often on the basis of morality. And in social science, just like other sciences, we want to try to replicate as much as possible, right? So it's good to be guided by the work that has come before us. But I totally agree that changing that certainly changes the results, both in aggregate, but also of which individual people are maybe changing their support, right? So like I've taken out the word morality. And to get back to somebody else's questions, I asked simply about sports, right? And I got different results because, framing it in this other form of opposition led to a slightly different subset of people saying that they were opposed to transgender rights. There's often a lot of overlap. People who are opposing transgender rights based on morality are also opposing transgender rights for these other reasons, but it is a Venn diagram. There are some people on either side of that. Yeah. So thank you for that question.
Let's go to question number 3 at the front.
Yes. You asked at the end, what kinds of campaigns will improve the situation here? And I think the campaign that should be done is the big truth, which is they target tiny groups because they're tiny. They can cover up the bad effects of what they're doing, and most of their majority doesn't know any people in the category that are being traumatized, et cetera, so that after they've done it, they can convince people that society has improved, that their authoritarian power is being exercised wisely, and therefore they can move on and target their opponents, their significant opponents of significant size. And that is the big truth, and that's what can beat this, I think.
You lost him.
You're not gonna get the prize.
Yes, Lord.
Yeah, so I think that's a big part of it, right? If we think about how norms of racial equality were created, a lot of it had to do with it was a sizable group that had built some political power, right? Transgender community is not a big group and doesn't have much political power. So, I certainly agree with that. And, there's always the question of building multiracial coalitions to try to combat some of this. And that, for a variety of reasons, has proven to be quite tricky, right? Of getting people who are all being in different ways marginalized by, discriminated against by some of the similar people and similar parties, similar groups to band together. And that has proven to be quite difficult. I think we very much saw that in 2024, in the 2024 elections.
Okay, Polly has her hand up over Zoom. So, Polly, do you want to unmute your microphone and ask your question?
I actually put my hand down. I meant it to be a clap rather than a hand raise.
Okay.
So,
Okay, no worries at all. Okay, we're going to take another question over Zoom. Manish, so I'm going to read it out for the audience. Why doesn't your research of media include the New York Times, the AP, the Oregonian?
Yeah, good question. The really that comes down to ease of access. So there's a great repository called GDELT, and you can just go to GDELT and look this stuff up. They capture and transcribe every minute of Fox, CNN, and MSNBC, and some other stations. And so it's very easy to analyze that data. If I was to get into the New York Times, the AP, the Oregonian, all of these, it would just be a lot more work on my end. And so just thinking about what is feasible to include into a book, I got all the survey data, I got all these experiments I'm running. I think throughout the course of this book, I fielded 7 or 8 original surveys, plus all this other survey data I was analyzing. It was just too much. And so, for example, what I'm working on now, we're now scraping social media. And so that's this whole other set of data, right? And so, I think it'd be interesting, certainly, to look at, do the trends I found on Fox, CNN, and MSNBC, are they replicated in platforms like the New York Times? But it's a little harder to get access to transcribe New York Times data. So, you might have to do that yourself, which is pretty time consuming.
Let's go to question number 4 at the Friendly House.
If marriage equality represented a major tipping point for gay and lesbian relationships and people within the US, what, from your research, or what is it that you're hearing could be a tipping point for the transgender community so that they could no longer be the villain at hand? Is it just unisex bathrooms, or is there something that will normalize relationships in such a way that people will then realize that this is a nothing burger and we can move on with our lives?
Yeah, great question. So, I will say I don't have like a ton of insight on this, but just talking to people who are working in those spaces, I do think the biggest thing is gender affirming care, because I think the argument is that, by showing support for gender affirming care, you show that you understand this is a real community, right? These are real people who are being impacted. And so that is kind of the aim of gender affirming care, taking away access to that is having the biggest effect on people's lives. And so getting support for that would, one, be a huge boost to members of the community, but would also be a pretty strong signal of, hey, we actually do support the basic needs of this community. And I'm sure there's arguments for, a federal bathroom bill or a federal bill around sports. Maybe that is the thing, but I think there's a real argument for this gender affirming care policy as well. But, I think that's something that people are struggling with right now is, this has gotten to a real fever pitch, right? And there's not a ton of support coming very vocally from many sectors of society. And so, I think there's probably a long road before it is shown that this can be a nothing burger. Yeah, great question.
We'll take our next question over Zoom. It actually comes from Mike Boucher. The suggested question to ask Republicans: if a Republican politician who supports anti-trans legislation is caught in a sex crime, one of that's hypothetical or not, would you still vote for him/her?
Wow, yeah, that's good. One of the things that we just very consistently see is something called confirmation bias, right? Is, you know, any new piece of information just confirms what you already believed, right? And we tend to change our beliefs based on the party that we support or the candidate or politician that we support, right? So, you know, one of the more famous ones here was there was a experiment that was run back in 2017. And so I think people probably remember the Access Hollywood tape, right? And, you know, Donald Trump said that he would grab a woman by, and, you know, I won't say the word. And so someone ran an experiment there, and they showed half of the respondents, you know, hey, if a man in your presence said that, would you think that was appropriate or inappropriate, right? And then the other half were asked, you know, Donald Trump said this, is it appropriate or inappropriate? And basically you saw that, you know, 70-ish% of Republicans said that was inappropriate when it was, you know, random man. And that dropped to like 30% among people who are told that was Donald Trump who said that, right? Versus Democrats stayed pretty steady, 85-ish% saying that was inappropriate in either condition. And so, you know, I would be curious about your question. And you know, I think, yeah, probably wouldn't be too difficult to find a real example of this. And see, you know, do people continue to support this person? Do they support the same kind of legislation? Or does that hypocrisy change anything? I think there are reasons to believe that, you know, maybe they would still support the politician and do some mental gymnastics to maintain that support. But maybe that, you know, the actual being caught in a sex crime, maybe that's enough that crosses some line. So yeah, I think that's a really a good suggestion. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, we'll go to question number 5 at the.
So my question is, when you were doing these surveys and stuff, did you consider a financial situation as for opposition to transgender, like transgender care costs my insurance more? It takes away from cancer research or things like that.
Interesting. No, I didn't consider that. I mean, I guess so I guess there's two parts of this. Of does someone perceive there to be a financial issue, and could that lead someone to oppose transgender rights? And then I guess it'd be interesting to also look at, is there actually much financial cost? I don't know what the numbers are of, you know, how much, for example, having gender affirming care impacts taxes, or how much, you know, the government is putting towards that. I mean, honestly, my guess would be that the stuff that the government has done to surveil and punish schools for teaching about transgender ideas within transgenderism or homosexuality probably cost the government a lot more than any gender affirming care. So I mean, I wouldn't buy too much into that reality of that argument as the funding argument, but that's an interesting suggestion for whether finances might play a role in why people express opposition to transgender rights. So I will write that down. Thank you for that suggestion.
Yep, a nice open question to go towards. Okay, last two questions at the friendly house. First from question.
I'm curious. You mentioned about Democrats and Republicans now being so separate that people wouldn't want their loved one to marry someone of a different party. Do you see any future that this will not be so divisive?
Yeah, so, you know, I'm glad you asked about that. You know, my the second big project I'm starting to work on right now is about social isolation, and thinking about ways to hopefully combat social isolation in these different ways, because I think that's a big part of it is, there's this idea of countervailing effects, right? It's a lot easier to express whatever views that you have when the people around you tend to already agree with you, right? It's a little harder when your views are challenged, and that can lead to some changes in how you think, how you act, what you say. And there's a lot being done. I really like this organization called More Like Us, that's trying to combat political polarization starting at the high school level. There's tons of initiatives that are happening of just getting people into rooms to talk to one another. I think there's a growing spotlight on kind of what we call third spaces, right? Non-home, non-work, actual public spaces where people can get together in community. So I wouldn't necessarily say I'm like optimistic, but I'm certainly hopeful that, as more attention comes to the just massive problem, I think, of hyperpolarization and social isolation, all of these strategies that are coming out and the energy that's being put towards it can lead to a society where we don't have that kind of just massive segregation and that inability to kind of just sit down and talk with one another.
Let's take our final question. It comes from question number 7 at the Friendly House.
Okay, so here in my bubble, over the last 10 years, I've seen a lot more people come out as transgender in my social group and my work group than ever before in my life. Is this trend, basically, is this my bubble, or is this trend continuing nationally despite this vitriol? Is the genie out of the bottle, or is it stopping and everybody's putting their regular gender clothes back
on? Okay, this is a good question to end with, and I'm sorry, I gotta go get my son in a second. So I probably live in a very similar bubble, but I do think that the anti-transgender attacks are going to continue to be a big part of the 2026 midterms, I think. But I do think that attention is starting to shift, right? People are talking more and more about affordability, right? And what we've almost always seen is that economic concerns tend to trump a lot of these other issues, right? So when there is economic precarity, when people feel like they can't afford healthcare, they can't afford housing, they can't afford childcare, those tend to supersede so many of these other concerns, right? And I think that's why, the 2024 election, despite, anti-transgender ads being kind of the most pervasive part of it, was largely about affordability, right? I think in a lot of ways, Kamala Harris and the Democrats lost because of inflation and other aspects of affordability. And I think that, Republicans are gearing up for losses this year, and it'll largely be about affordability. And I say that because I think it starts to take some of the attention away from the transgender community. And there's other kind of battles being fought on different frontiers. And so, as long as that continues to be a growing and major story in people's lives, I think people will care a little bit less about bathrooms and gender affirming care and transgender people in sports.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Let's give Manish one more big round of applause. Spending time with us. We really appreciate your presentation and advice you gave to us. So thank you very much.
Of course.
This ain't coming from no prophet, just an ordinary man. When I close my eyes, I see the way this world shall be when we all walk hand in hand. When the last child cries for a crust of bread, when the last man dies, but just words that he said. When the last are over, the poor is dead. We shall be free. The last thing we notice is the color of skin, and the first thing we look for is the beauty within. When the skies and oceans are clean again, we shall be free. We shall be free. We shall be free. Stand straight, walk proud. We shall be free. Free to love anyone we choose. When this world's big enough for all different views. When we all can worship from our own kind of pews. We shall be free. We shall be free. We shall be free. Have a little faith, hold out, 'cause we shall be free. Money talks for the very last time, and nobody walks a step behind. When there's only one race, and that's mankind, we shall be free. We shall be free. We shall be free. Stand straight, hold out. We shall be free. We shall be free. We shall be free. Won't back down. No, I won't back down. You could stand me up at the gates of hell, but I won't back down. No, I stand my ground. Won't be turned around. And I'll keep this world from dragging me down, but I'll stand my ground, and I won't back down. Hey, baby, there ain't no easy way out. Hey, I will stand my ground, and I won't back down. Well, I know what's right. I got just one line. In a world that keeps on pushing me around, gonna stand my ground, and I won't back down. Hey, baby, there ain't no easy way out. Hey, I stand my ground, and I won't back down. Hey, baby, there ain't no easy way out. Hey, I stand my
I'm on my second cup of coffee. I still can't face the day. Thinking about a lady who got lost along the way. And if I don't stop this trembling hand from reaching for the phone, I'll be reaching for the bottle, Lord, before this day is done. I'm on my second cup of coffee. I still can't face the day. Oh, the room was filled with laughs as we sang the night away. But my sleep was filled with dreaming of the wrongs that I had done, and a gentle, sweet reminder of a daughter and a son. I'm sitting alone, my friends have all gone home. You never know when they'll come dropping in. Thinking of girls with their fingers in my curls, too young to understand how love begins. I'm on my second cup of coffee. I still can't face the dawn. The radio is playing the soft country song. And if I don't stop this trembling hand from reaching for the phone, I'll be reaching for the bottle, Lord, before this day is done. I'm sitting alone, my friends have all gone home, well, they never were around when I needed them. Thinking of girls with their fingers in my curls, too young to understand how love begins. I'm on my second cup of coffee, I still can't face the day. Thinking about a lady who got lost along the way. And if I don't stop this trembling hand from reaching for the phone, I'll be reaching for the bottle, Lord, before this day's done. And if I don't stop this trembling hand from reaching for the phone, I'll be reaching for the bottle, Lord, before this day's done. Those notes are too high for the first song. I'm burned out. Yes. As Gordon likes it. I take it you don't have one on the tip of your head.
No. You got one there?
Yeah, John Denver.
Okay.
It's 5 o'clock this morning, and the sun is on the rise. There's frosting on the window pane, sorrow in your eyes. Stars are fading quietly, the night is nearly gone. So you turn away from me, and tears begin to come. And it's goodbye again. I'm sorry to be leaving you. Goodbye again. 'Cause if you didn't know, it's goodbye again. And I wish you could tell me, why do we always fight when I have to go? It seems a shame to leave you now. The days are soft and warm. I long to lay me down again and hold you in my arms. I long to kiss your tears away and give you back your smile. But other voices beckon me, and for a little while it's goodbye again. I'm sorry to be leaving you. Goodbye again. 'Cause if you didn't know, it's goodbye again. And I wish you could tell me, why do we always fight when I have to go? I have to go and see some friends of mine, some that I don't know, and some who aren't familiar with my name. It's something that's inside of me, not hard to understand. It's anyone who listened to me sing. And if your hours are empty now, who am I to blame? You think if I were always here, our love would be the same. As it is, the time we have is worth the time alone. Lying by your side, greatest peace I've ever known. It's goodbye again. I'm sorry to be leaving you. Goodbye again. 'Cause if you didn't know, it's goodbye again. And I wish you could tell me, why do we always fight when I have to go? And now another happy one. Where did the other mic go? The other mic I stuck on there. It disappeared. I think you took it back that
That's not it. All of me, why not take all of me? Can't you see that I love you? Take my lips, I want to lose them. Take my arms, I'll never use them. Your goodbye left me with eyes that cry. How can I go on, dear, without you? You took the part that once was my heart, so why not take all of me? All of me, why not take all of me? Can't you see I'm no good without you? Take my lips, I want to lose them. Take my arms, I'll never use them. your goodbye left me with eyes that cry. How can I go on, dear, without you? You took the part that once was my heart, so why not take all of me? You took the part that once was my heart, so why not take all of me? Thanks. That one is so much fun.
That once was my heart. Why not take all of me? Exactly right.
Well, should we have Hank come in?
Sure.
Steal one of those microphones
right over here. Got your breath back there?
Yeah.
We're a dance band. Okay, where'd that other mic go?
Can I steal this one?
Oh, it's up there. It appeared again.
What has he done?
That whole thing.
You've got a friend first? Yeah.
When you're down and troubled and you need a helping hand, and nothing is going right. Close your eyes and think of me, and soon I will be there to brighten up even your darkest night. Now y'all know the refrain. You just call out my name, and you know wherever I am, I'll come running, running, running to see you again. Winter, spring, summer, or fall, all you gotta do is call, and I'll be there, yes I will. You got a friend. When the sky above you should grow dark and full of clouds, and that old north wind should begin to blow, well, you just keep your head together and call my name out loud. Soon I'll be knocking upon your door, because you just call out my name, and you know wherever I am, I'll come running, 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 running to see you again. Oh, winter, spring, summer, or fall, all you got to do is call, and I'll be there, yes I will. Well, ain't it good to know that you got a friend when people can be so cold? They'll hurt you and desert you. You know they'll take your soul if you let them. So don't you let them. You just call out my name. And you know wherever I am, I'll come
running, yeah,
to see you again. Well, winter, spring, summer, or fall, all you gotta do is call, and I'll be there, yes I will. You got a friend. Ain't it good to know you got a friend? Ain't it good to know you got a friend? Good to know. Got some friends. Lucky me. Take the ribbon from your hair, shake it loose and let it fall, then soft against your skin, like the shadows on the wall. Come and lay down by my side till the early morning light. I'll take nothing but your time. Help me make it through the night. We won't play who's right, who's wrong, and you won't have to understand. We'll let the devil take tomorrow. If tonight you'll take my hand. Yesterday is dead and gone, and tomorrow's out of sight. I don't want to be alone. Help me make it through the night. All right, a little instrumental interlude, ladies and gentlemen. We won't play who's right, who's wrong, and you won't have to understand. We'll let the devil take tomorrow. If tonight you'll take my hand. Yesterday is dead and gone, and tomorrow's out of sight. I don't want to be alone. Help me make it through the night. No one has to be alone. You'll just help them make it through the night.
Thanks, Hank. I was planning to do a different Christofferson song this morning. So Same key, it'll sound like the same song. I have seen the morning burning golden on the mountain in the sky. Aching with the feeling of the freedom of an eagle when she flies. Turning on the world the way she smiled upon my soul as I lay dying. Healing with the colors and the sunshine and the shadows in her eyes. Waking in the morning to the feeling of her fingers on my skin. Wiping out the traces of the people and the places that I'd been. Teaching me that yesterday was something that I'd never thought of trying. Talking of tomorrow and the money, love, and time we had to spend. Loving her was easier than anything I'll ever do again. Coming close together with a feeling that I'd never felt before in my time. She ain't ashamed to be a woman or afraid to be a friend. I don't know the answer to the easy way she opened every door in my mind. But dreaming was as easy as believing it was never gonna end. And loving her was easier than anything I'll ever do again.